Okay, greetings. So in in this talk, I'm going to talk about the concept of soft power. Um, this is a new one that I've added to arts policy classes. It's become an interesting question, one I've not talked about before in class. I've posted a number of articles on the modules. Um, including Joseph Nye's very important article from 1990. You'll notice that every single thing that you read on this subject always quotes that one article going back to him. So it's a bit of a classic. Even if you're not majoring in arts management, it's still a classic paper to read. And we'll try to think about what soft power actually is, because this is an important aspect of arts policy. I mean, normally we think of arts policy in terms of what happens within our borders. So American arts policy is about, well, Americans and the arts, how we consume it, how we produce it, what we do. But what if it's the case that our arts policy actually influences how other countries perceive us? And what if it influences how they think about us? And what if, in turn, how other countries think about us influence their cooperation with us, whether on economic matters, environmental matters, national security matters, trade. Maybe it's the case that how people see us affects how they will work with us, and that can be fairly important. Okay, so culture is a big part of this. Culture is a big part of this. So in terms of thinking about the whole picture of arts policy, we need to also include discussions of soft power. Okay, so let's go back to Nye's article from 1990. So this is 30 years old. And one of the things that you notice in reading his article is that it seems old. A lot of his references seem very dated now. So, for example, in the article, Japan is given great prominence as an economic power. And most of you in this class are young, but I will tell you that through the 1980s and up to 1990, it was a major concern in the United States and around the world that Japan's economic power was simply going to be overwhelming, that they had so many riches, they were simply going to buy everybody's assets. There were feature films made about it, about sort of Japanese economic dominance. We don't really think about it now, but it was a very, very big deal then. And so, we can excuse Nye for, writing in that context and seeing it. He barely mentions China, because China at the time in 1990 was still relatively undeveloped. Okay, it was not an economic power by any means. Certainly nothing compared to Japan at the time. So, it is treated very differently. South Korea does not get mentioned at all in Nye's essay. It doesn't even appear. And it's interesting because in the soft power area, South Korea has been tremendously effective over the past couple of decades. Okay, you are all familiar with South Korean film. I mean, it won an Academy Award for Best Picture. You're familiar with K-pop, all of these cultural exports, and it doesn't even appear that Korea was not internationally, it was not seen as a thing. So it's interesting. So it is very much a historical essay, and you have to read it with that in mind. But his key points, though, it had staying power. Okay, and what he was trying to say is, look, for accomplishing national strategic goals, and he's very much a strategic thinker, okay, he's thinking about strategic goals, it's not about pure military might, okay, it's not about the size of your armies, and it is not about sort of pure international trade, okay? It also considers soft power. And what does he mean by soft power? Well, a short definition would be a country's ability to make friends and influence people through its most attractive assets. Okay, so if a country is seen in a fairly positive light, if you simply went around and did a poll of people saying, what is your feeling about this country or that country? any country that gets sort of a very positive ranking, we think good things about that place, it turns out it can have a fairly significant effect on that country's exports, for example. Okay, it's that country's economy. Just as individuals, we like to buy from companies of which we hold a good opinion. Okay, if there's a corporation that we think very poorly of because it's engaged in sort of what we think of as unsavory practices, we tend to not want to buy from them. And we do want to buy from companies that we see as being on the side of good. So it's the same is true of countries. Okay, it is not just a matter of our looking at sort of price and quality of product. All right, so that's what soft power is. Like, what do we think about a place? So where does arts and culture come in? This is an arts policy class. And how a country is perceived can be affected by its popular culture. Okay, and this can be a great source of influence. So again, especially in popular culture, look at South Korea and look at how it has changed perceptions of itself through music, through film, over the past 2 decades and so on. High culture, it can be difficult to see. The impact is hard to discern because, of course, high culture is only consumed by a minority of people. So I read one article, pointing out that the Louvre, or the French Museum, was opening up in Abu Dhabi, and they thought this would be a great example of French soft power. And the French are very, very proud of their soft power. They do believe that their long history of culture and the arts and literature and painting gives it great influence around the world, outsized influence relative to its sort of size or military might. But it remains to be seen. And in fact, the very fact that they are in Abu Dhabi is another interesting case studies, because the sort of very rich, oil-rich countries of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on, have really been trying in the past few years to make efforts in soft power to open up Western-style museums, try to open themselves up as tourist destinations, and try to be shown as, sort of different and exotic, but very interesting places to visit. They have a problem that we're going to return to a bit later, which is that if you have a very authoritarian regime, and they do, that can be hard to overcome. Okay, so this is the thing about soft power in the arts, is that it is culture in the widest sense of the word. Okay, it is not just a matter of its sort of actual arts goods. It's not a matter of its governments. In fact, sometimes a country can have a lot of soft power almost despite its government. It'll be interesting to see what happens to American soft power, since we've come through a time when, coming to the end of the presidency of Donald Trump, whatever you think about Donald Trump, he was not very interested in soft power at all. He saw himself as sort of a tough negotiator, and he did not really care very much for trying to cultivate a particular image. Okay, so that's what soft power is about. It's trying to have influence in countries, not through the power of military, not through the power of economics, but simply through its image, how people think about it. And art and culture can have a large part on that image. How we think about England is in a large part, for young people, shaped by, movies, things like Harry Potter, things like that. And so these things can really matter. A couple of limitations of this. One is that, what if it's the case that every country thinks it has soft power? Okay, because who could fail to like who we are? Now, as a Canadian, this really strikes me. Canadians are sort of have convinced themselves that they are very popular people, very likable, sort of gentle, and so on. Is it the case that Canada has sort of a soft power impact because of the way it is perceived in that sense, whether it's particularly true or not? We can be very biased. Most Canadians think that Canada is well liked. Most people in Denmark think Denmark is well liked and so on. So it's important to look for biases and to think about how it's actually defined. Another thing to think about is that soft power, and Nye makes this very clear in this essay, soft power is power, right? I mean, the whole point of it is to try to get other countries to do what you want them to do. You're doing it for a reason. You're doing it because you want them to cooperate in joint ventures. You want soft power because you want them to welcome your foreign direct investment in firms and so on. And so it is, you know, it is actually power. And, you know, we want to be cautious about that. Nye uses the example of raising children and how much easier it is to raise children when you instill in them the preferences that match your own. If you have children that, you know, want all the things that you want and don't want the things that you don't want, it makes them much easier to raise. But that's an uneasy metaphor because you don't want to think of other countries essentially as being in the position of children. Okay, so moving on to more recent events, getting past Nye's essay, and you really should read Nye's essay. The British Council and the University of Edinburgh, and our program has good friends at the University of Edinburgh and their cultural affairs studies. They did an empirical analysis of the actual effects of soft power. And so what they looked at was they took different assets that a country might think of as contributing to its soft power, and then took a list of outcomes that they think might be influenced by soft power and see if there's actually any empirical evidence of impact. It has a good, careful review of what we know and don't know about it. Soft power is actually a fairly difficult thing to measure, okay? So they have to choose you know, sort of particular variables that they think is going to measure soft power. So the things they list are a measure of political democracy and freedom. Now note even there the bias, right? They're thinking that what is going to make a soft power asset is a particular Western notion of political democracy. Not everybody might agree with that, okay? So you're already getting people thinking, other people must want what we want. We have a Western liberal democracy, so that must be soft power because that must be desirable. They also measure per capita income and different measures of cultural assets, the international reach of cultural institutions, and that's their main contribution to data, the country's ranking in sort of a poll, the Good Country Index, and the proportion of the population connected to the internet, which is kind of a funny one, but it's sort of how you know, connected people are. And the outcomes are that they measure are incoming international students, incoming international tourists, levels of foreign direct investment, and whether votes in the United Nations are drawn from soft power. So, you know, any study like this is going to be kind of sketchy, and you can sort of think about, well, what variables should they include and what shouldn't they? So, for example, they say, well, the US and the United Kingdom seem to attract a lot of international students, and you think, well, yeah, but they would, because they have all of these very top-ranked universities. These are two very rich countries. They're using English, which is sort of, you know, considered globally the most desirable language to learn. You know, their universities are very rich, so lots of students want to go to Harvard or Stanford, or Indiana, or to Oxford, or to Cambridge, or to Edinburgh. So of course those are very popular, and but that's not necessarily what you would say is a measure of soft power. Okay. Foreign direct investment might be affected by those variables, but people might also just want to look for low costs, avoiding tariff barriers, and so on. So, you know, an example I would use is that, you know, Mercedes-Benz opened a big manufacturing plant in Alabama. I don't think it was the soft power of the state that did that. I don't think it was the culture in the state that did that. I think it was probably low wages, okay, right to work laws, you know, amenable climate, right? Don't get a lot of snow down in Alabama. So, you know, it's hard to measure sort of what kinds of things matter and what kinds of things don't. But anyway, an interesting attempt to actually see how these things might work, okay? The last readings I have up are a couple of articles about China. And China is an interesting case because it is fairly recently that it has really tried to increase its level of soft power. And remember, what the goal here is how people perceive your country. It is not about military might. It is not about economic power, but about whether countries will cooperate with you on joint ventures because they see you in sort of friendly terms, in very favorable terms, okay? So China has been making various investments in this. In the United States, especially, the Confucius Institutes are a means of establishing in universities across the US centers for Chinese language, Chinese culture, you know, both traditional culture in terms of you know, music, cuisine, and so on, and also high culture and study, and of course languages. Investments in sort of infrastructure, especially in Africa, where China has been very active there, and in the cultural sphere as well, trying to boost internationally its movie industry, doing a lot of co-productions with the United States. China, of course, has a very big box office for films, and so you get a lot of partnerships with US studios in terms of making films. And of course, one of the conditions that we see in those films is that China is not presented in an unfavorable light, but rather we see cooperation. Okay, I remember going to see the film The Martian. And if you did go see the film The Martian, you'll remember that it portrayed great cooperation between the United States and China. So in that kind of soft power regime, China has been making real efforts. And I encourage you to read both the article from The Economist and the other foreign affairs article on exactly how they've been trying to do that through film, through investments, and so on. But it's also a warning in that soft power is not something you can simply buy, okay? You cannot simply create it out of sort of particular targeted investments in certain cultural features and think, this will give us soft power, this will make us liked. How we think about a particular country and how we think about its culture, how we think about how much we want to cooperate with it, depends on a lot of things. You know, in terms of its people, in terms of how its own state treats its people, and so on. And it is very nuanced. And so simply creating both high or popular cultural goods does not necessarily engender trust. And sometimes the way that, that soft power works can often be much more subtle, okay? I think one thing that increases soft power more than anything, if I can use my own personal experience, is simply international interaction. The more we actually meet people from other countries, that tends to increase their soft power. The more you meet anybody from any country, the more you get to know about that country, the more you see the good in people, and that can happen. Can you really promote this through culture? I'm not sure how much it can be forced. And this is, I think, the big policy issue on soft power is to what degree can you consciously use it in arts policy to try to improve the standing of your country, or if it's just so complex, depending on sort of your own popular culture, your own imagery, and a lot of things that are simply not directly under your control. So do the readings. I've also, I wrote a few blog posts on this, and so I've added to the modules. You'll see I've written 3 blog posts on soft power. I've drawn on them a bit for this lecture. So do have a look there, and I'll look forward to talking about this in class.